Hey, Reverend Kim Polchow here from Marshfield, UMC. I might be a little bit hard to hear. I'm at one of my favorite places in the world. Check it out. I'm at the Ice Park getting ready for an MSU Bears hockey game. Very excited about it. Got my season ticket. Woo! I hope you're excited today about worship. We're continuing our Shipwreck story. Love this series. I hope you have a great week. Welcome, welcome, welcome to the streets.
Acts 27, verses 33 through 38. Just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. For the last 14 days, he said, you have been in constant suspense, and I've gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. Now I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head. After he said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of them all. Then he broke it and began to eat. They were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. Altogether, there were 276 of us on board. When they had eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing grain into the sea.
At some point in this journey of becoming a pastor, my personality was tested using the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, or MBTI. And I was identified as an INTJ. Myers-Briggs has 16 basic personality types, specified by 4 pairs of letters. So there's 4 different categorizations, and you're either one letter or another. It's a little binary. My type means I am more introverted than extraverted, which is how Myers-Briggs uses that word. That's the I. The way I take in information is generally through intuition rather than sensing, so that's the N. I prefer to make decisions by thinking rather than feeling, so that's the T. That doesn't mean I always do that. That's just the ideal. And in the way I deal with the world, I tend to make decisions rather than perceive things. So that's judgment over perception, and that's the J. The opposite of me would probably be a really nice, easy person who was extroverted, sensing, feeling, perceiver. And they're great, but most of my long-term friends are INTJs, or they're one letter off from that. We're different on one pair. INTJs tend to be analytical, independent, strategic, conceptual. Now, you may not be familiar with this categorization system, or maybe you did it at work because that was a thing for a while. But some of you, when you talk to me at church, sound like you do. My friend Susan regularly tells me I take too long to make a decision, and that's an INTJ thing because I am still collecting data. But she also gets frustrated because when I make a decision, that is it, and we are not going back to it, and that's an INTJ thing. There's a guy here named Kurt Singer who is in the choir, and he calls me the general sometimes when I walk in the room, particularly when I'm in my heels. That is the kind of thing people call INTJs. Our personality type is generally called the architect or the mastermind because we're usually collecting data and then assembling it into larger concepts. So there's a lot of thinking, but there's also some creativity involved. And then we walk through the world tall because we know, we figured it out. Now, we may not stop to tell you what we figured out because we are already thinking about tomorrow's thing. Now, some of the struggles people who test as INTJs experience are that sometimes our independence turns into isolation. A few weeks ago, I told you I sometimes struggle to say hi to everybody. That's an INTJ thing. We're also really, really hard on ourselves, perfectionists. And we can go too far in saying, no, look, it's like this, to people who don't care what we know because they know how they feel. We don't understand them. Years ago, a church I served was about to make a decision. It wasn't a crucial decision. It was which copier they were going to buy. We had research and samples and the best deal. It was so obvious, but that's not the copier they wanted to buy because they had feelings about the companies and where they were located and the copier samples and what kind of picture they'd use. And I met with my DS, my district superintendent, around that time, and I told him, they're driving me nuts. They're about to make the wrong decision on this copier. And the DS said to me, no, your job is process, not outcome. Your responsibility is holding them to the proper process for making a decision, not holding them to a certain outcome. Let them buy the wrong copier. That's not your job. That was a perfect boundary to set with me. And, INTJs love boundaries. It's been my mantra in church council meetings ever since. My job is process, not outcome. Paul's on the ship that's going to wreck. They've been in a long, drawn-out storm for a couple of weeks. They haven't had time or the stomachs to eat. The lifeboat has been cut free. They're anchored away from a shore they can't see yet, but they think is there. And Paul says, we should eat something. We are going to need our strength. So he took bread, gave thanks to God, broke the bread. And does this sound familiar? But it wasn't communion. It was just how Paul ate. He took the bread, gave thanks to God, broke the bread, and ate in front of all these men who were kind of at the end of their rope, that we just cut to set the lifeboat free. We should eat, he says, because we are going to live. Thanks be to God. We should eat and be ready and strong for what's coming next, because even though it has been awful and it is awful today, it might be more awful tomorrow, but there will be a tomorrow for all of us. I've used this acronym before in sermons. Hold on, possibilities exist. Hope. Thanks be to God. So they ate until they were full, and then they shoveled out the grain to lighten the ship. They ate, and then they threw away the rest of their food stores. This is the moment when they demonstrate that they are starting to hope. This is the moment they start holding on because possibilities exist. What are they holding on to? What are they holding on by? God has this. He's trusting God with the process. They're trusting Paul's God with the process for an unsure outcome. So they have hope in the process, hope in Paul's God, hope in the right place. When my son was born, I had everything I'd ever wanted. I was, in the words of Mary Gilmore, living the dream. I had a job I loved, a fantastic house, the best dog in the world, Stella, a husband, and now a little baby boy. He was so cute. He was so easy as a baby, so easy to love. And at night, when I put him to bed in his crib, I would hold him for a few final moments as he was settling down for sleep in his little baby straitjacket, his little swaddled sleeper that he liked to be wrapped up tight in for the first few months of his life. So I'd hold my little glowworm and I would pray like I had never prayed in my life, fervently, for all I wanted for him: a good life, a stable home, to stay in that beautiful house for his whole childhood, a happy marriage for his parents, that he'd know and offer God's grace in the world, that he'd find his call, that he'd be happy, that we'd make good decisions, and that he'd be bright and successful and happily partnered in his adulthood. And the pastor in me said, that's not faithful prayer. The mama in me was pouring out her desires for her child. The mama in me shoved the pastor out of the way every night, but it was a battle. The thinking INTJ pastor wasn't sure to do with all these new mama feelings, but I was also an INTJ mom, so I could see what the building blocks were for his successful long-term future. I just had to tell God every night, My prayers were a mess, a conversation before God between the thoughts and feelings I was trying to hold in myself at the same time. And the pastor would say, you can't pray like that. And I'd say, well, I know what he needs. And I usually ended those prayers with tears running down my face, because living the dream is usually not what it looks like from the outside, and harder than it looks. Things were coming apart at the seams, and I couldn't make it all work and still be myself. And now that I had someone else to fight for, to pray for fervently, I was INTJ hard on myself for not getting it right. Why can't I just figure this out and make it all work? And when I'd be in the dark with the swish of the noise machine blocking out all the noise of the world, holding my sweet little bundle of responsibility and love, saying to God all the outcomes I demanded for him, I would see that it was not going to work on my end. While my brain yelled, you're doing it wrong. You're doing it wrong was all I heard those days, no matter what people said to me. There is so much mom shaming. I literally had women say the words shame on you to me for not doing things the way they'd done with their children, for not filtering his water or feeding my baby what they fed their baby. You're doing it wrong was when I heard in the moments when I had to put my child before my work. And you're doing it wrong was what I heard when my work had to come before my child for a moment and someone else had to take care of him. You're doing it wrong was what I heard from my husband. I couldn't make it all work and still be me. And when myself was getting so beaten down, it was hard to fight for myself, that person that God had made to be just as I was, that person that just everyone thought was getting it wrong. And when it all unraveled, when it became clear that it wasn't working, it was awful. I have no pictures of myself from that year because I deleted all of them. I looked terminally sad, like I would never be happy again in my life. So defeated, so hopeless. These weren't my outcomes. I mean, standing alone with a toddler on my hip and a nervous boxer and an old beagle by my side in a smaller house that needed a whole lot of work to be a good home. That's not me. Like John Wesley during his crisis of faith, I knew I had to keep preaching until I had that good faith, but I was screaming inside me, why? Why couldn't I keep that? Why couldn't it work? Why can't I have good things? Why did everyone have to see the failure? And why did everyone need to comment on it? Why do I have to live here? What are you doing to me? What did I do wrong? And the pastor in me, INTJ or not, knew this was not logical. But the mama in me was furious, mostly furious at myself, a little furious at God. And my brain just wanted space and time and aloneness to figure it all out, to build understanding out of all these pieces of data that were crashing into me and out of me. But there was no time for that. There was no more alone. I had a home to make for my child. I hired my friend Grant to knock down a wall, and then I picked up my own hammer. I started tearing off paneling and refinishing walls. I put on a Tyvek suit and killed the weeds that thought they were my yard, and I planted actual grass. I shoveled rock out and shoveled mulch in. I made the finicky landscaping manageable. I stripped cabinets and painted the front door. I sweated like I had never sweat before, and I broke off the fingernails that had been used to getting manicures every 2 weeks. I had dead trees cut down, and I comforted the hurting and preached the word and told bedtime stories and made doctor's appointments and enrolled a kid in preschool. And when no one was watching, I shook my fist at myself and at God. And my mom would remind me to eat because I needed fuel for tomorrow's work. You know, you got to have energy to shake your fist and move sprinklers at 5:30 in the morning. And then I started to wonder if the dream I'd been living had really been my dream after all, or if I just thought that was my dream because people told me I was living the dream, because my life wasn't really that bad. I mean, it wasn't what I wanted. It wasn't what I'd planned. It wasn't what I'd asked for. It wasn't the outcome I'd hoped for. But, you know, all things considered, standing alone with a toddler on my hip and a nervous boxer and an old beagle by my side and a smaller house that just needed a little more paint wasn't so bad. I mean, sure, I couldn't afford a lawn guy anymore, but I wrote my best sermons pushing the lawnmower. I finally had lots of time to think about all I wanted to think about, which is heaven for an INTJ. I didn't go to bed at night next to someone I loved, but I also didn't lay awake at night and wonder if the person next to me actually loved me. I didn't have a lot of social life, but I had grubby little hands in the dirt with mine. I didn't live in a home a builder had customized to my taste, but I lived in a home I had customized to my taste. I didn't have the homeowners association meetings anymore, but my neighbors came to me for yard advice. And when one busybody neighbor came over to tell me he thought I was doing something wrong in the yard, I said, "I don't think you live here." She was back. The part I was doing wrong that led to most of my unhappiness was focusing on outcomes and not the process. God was doing with my life what I was doing to my house, full-scale renovation. I had God to thank for the food on my table, for the little hand in mine, for loving me through the shipwreck of my life, for helping me stay me, instead of giving myself away for a dream that really wasn't mine, for possibilities existing when all I could see was that I didn't get the outcomes I was supposed to have. And I remembered the words of that DS. My responsibility is process, not outcome. And I realized it was the same with my faith, with my trust in God, and with my prayers. It wasn't so much about getting a certain outcome. It was about trusting God through the process of grief, through the process of change, through the process of failure, through the process of shipwreck, through the process of life, because the outcomes are in God's hands. They're not mine to choose or to make lists of. My job is to trust God in the process. And that's your job too. To trust God in the process, to pray fervently that God's will be done, even when you have figured out exactly what God's will needs to be. You know, Paul's faith was enough for the other 275 people to sit down and eat. Paul's faith in God during the process of shipwreck made the others hold on because they saw that possibilities existed, because Paul had faith that God would do whatever. God would do God things. Who would your faith encourage if your hope stayed in the right place during shipwreck? There's no telling how we could transform our world, our community, our families, if we all learn to be the people on the ship that have our hope in the right place when things get tough. In God, in the process, hold on. Possibilities exist. Amen.